Have you seen our garden? If you go out the front of our building and to the right, to my right, there are two raised bed gardens that were planted back in late April. One of the first things that we did here as a church, even before we had the doors open and electricity on, a garden was planted. Thanks to the initiative of some folks like Marshall Metters and folks at the United Way and good friends from Home Depot who actually came and built the raised beds and brought all the supplies and helped plant the garden. We have a beautiful garden. Mary Carews, raise your hand, Mary. Mary is our parish nurse, and she has been helping to oversee the garden. And I am so thrilled that to tell you that last Monday at the community meal held here, Mary brought okra and tomatoes out of our garden, and the folks gathered, ate fried green tomatoes and fried okra. So the garden is flourishing. Just go out there and look at it. I'm not a gardener, but something I've noticed about this particular garden is there does not seem to be very many weeds. Now, I don't know the reason for that. I guess the good soil that the Home Depot folks planted in. But also, it seems to me that the garden space is so full with good things that the weeds simply don't have any space to grow. One of the details often lost in the translation of this parable that Christy read for us and Jesus tells about the wheat and the weeds is that the word Jesus uses, which we translate generically as weed, is in fact a very specific sort of weed. It is, in scientific terminology, Lolium timoletum, I believe, if I pronounced that correctly. Also known as bearded darnel. An annual grass with long, slender bristles that looks very much like wheat. It would be easy to mistake it for the real thing. And in a frenzy of weed pulling, you could possibly yank up the good along with the bad. I'm not sure this parable fits very well with the movement of our times and the need that we all seem to have for greater clarity. For folks are clamoring for answers and clear definitions when it comes to moral decision making and deciding who is acceptable and who is not. Who are the saved and who are the unsaved? Who are the clean and who are the unclean? Who are the real Christians and who are the heathen? Who is God's child and who is not God's child? That yearning for more defined delineations has always been among us, but in times of rapid change and growing unsettledness, when fear pervades our lives even more, we want to know with greater certainty where is the evil and how do we avoid it. In that kind of atmosphere, this story told by Jesus may not ease our troubled hearts and minds. For in this kind of atmosphere, the desire to begin pulling weeds seems stronger and stronger. The stories making headlines even this week confirm once more evil is real and the innocent suffer. These are stories we hear almost every week. Several years ago, you may recall a story on the news about a young boy in New York City walking home from a summer program. He gets lost. He asks directions from a man who looked like most of his neighbors in this Hasidic Jewish neighborhood. and the 8-year-old boy is found murdered in ways too horrible for me to recount. The comment made about the man caught on videotape leading the boy away and subsequently arrested, the comment made about him by members of the community, he appeared so normal, just like one of us. No past history of anything like this before. The news last week out of Atlanta was more than I could almost listen to, and every time it came on CNN or whatever news program I happened to be watching, I had to turn away, if not shut the volume down. I could not bear to hear the details of what that child, that 2 or 3-year-old child, suffered when his father left him in the cop car all day long. In one of those stories, though, about this incident, Alex Hall, who was a friend of Justin Harris, the father, they'd been friends since their sophomore year of college and was a co-worker with him at Home Depot, said that Justin Harris had talked so much about how much he loved his son all the time. And he said he and another co-worker and college friend and Harris had gone to lunch that very day this happened. And they planned to go to the movies after work that day. Paul said nothing stuck out. Nothing was weird. He looked like wheat. Who knew weeds of dangerous depravity were mixed within? A few years back, my wife Jean and I were visiting my family in Indiana at Christmas time, and through Facebook we had reconnected with some old friends who live in northern Kentucky from where we moved here to Anderson. They invited us to their home for dinner one evening, and we engaged in what you do with friends that you haven't seen or talked to for several years. We reminisced about old times, and we caught up on what's happening in our lives. In the course of our conversation, somewhat out of the blue, our friend Peggy, we've known Peggy for a long time, shared that her brother, whom we also had known, we all had gone to the same Baptist church in northern Kentucky, her brother was in prison, serving 30 years for his involvement in a murder. It would seem that as a married man, he had gotten involved with a married woman, and together with an accomplice, they had arranged and carried out the murder of this married woman's husband. Peggy and her parents, of course, had been devastated by all of this. This is a church-going, hard-working, middle-class family. Her parents, she said, made the 2-hour drive every other weekend faithfully to visit their son, now in prison. No one would have dreamed this would be their life, their son. You see, wheat and weeds sometimes get all mixed together. The trouble with the notion of ridding the world of evil by pulling up the weeds is that all too often the very act of pulling up the weeds becomes evil in and of itself. History is littered with the tragedies inflicted by extremists who were determined to purify the world of God's enemies. Men who fly planes into buildings, leaders who send out hit squads, dictators who order whole ethnic groups of people to gas chambers, all acted in the name of pulling up the weeds of society. As one commentator on this passage said, there are extremists all over the world today who believe that they have a mandate from their God, literally, to destroy those whom they deem to be enemies of God. Surely the Christian church, in a world so polarized and filled with terror because of religious success, surely Christ's people have a special responsibility to bear witness to a far better way. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once put it, God's purpose is not wrathful judgment. God's purpose is redemption. And the road to redemption is by way of reconciliation. Only in that way will the world finally be saved. Today's parable warns us against relying on our human capacity to know fully the mind of God. Who are we to presume we know what God wants? And suggests that what might appear to be good and pure to us may not necessarily be either one. Perhaps you have known a person who presented him or herself as a saint, and then something happened that revealed another side. The story is told of an incident at a traffic light. A man was stopped, waiting for the light to turn green. When the light changed, he was distracted and he didn't budge. And the woman in the car behind him honked her horn, and he still didn't move. And she honked it again. And by this time, she was pounding on the steering wheel. She was blowing her horn nonstop. And finally, just as the light turned yellow, the fellow in the first car woke up and he drove through the light. Well, the woman in the second car was simply beside herself. Still mid-rant, she heard a tap on her car window. She looked up to see the face of a police officer. "Lady, you're under arrest," he said. "Get out of the car. Put your hands up." He took her to the police station, had her fingerprinted, photographed, and then put her in a holding cell. And hours passed. The officer returned and unlocked the cell door. He escorted her back to the booking desk. "Sorry for the mistake, lady," he said. "But I pulled up behind you as you were blowing your horn and cursing out the fellow who was in front of you. And I noticed the stickers on your bumper. And one read, 'Follow me to Sunday school.' And the other said, 'What would Jesus do?' So he says, 'Lady, I naturally assumed you had stolen the car.'" Maybe Jesus is reminding us not to wear our piety on our sleeves or on our bumpers. According to today's parable, those who present their righteousness for all the world to see and feel superior to everyone else just might end up as pieces of kindling when all is said and done. Only God knows who and what are useful in the kingdom of Christ. Jim Somerville, a Baptist pastor of churches in Virginia and North Carolina, tells this story. He said, "I asked the people at my last church to imagine what would happen if we adopted a policy of weed pulling. If we drew a circle around the little town of Wingate, North Carolina, and we made a vow that no evil would cross that line, that no weeds would grow within that border." He said, "You know, you and I could spend the rest of our lives protecting that boundary, standing shoulder to shoulder with pitchforks and clubs, making sure that we kept drugs and alcohol and pornography and gambling safely on the other side. I think it would take all of our energy and most of our time. But what if we did that? What if we succeeded? What would we have? We would have a town characterized by the absence of evil, which is not the same as a town characterized by the presence of good. And maybe this is what Jesus was talking about all along, that it's better to have a wheat field with weeds in it than a field with nothing in it at all. When that church in Wingate, North Carolina began a ministry to the children of a nearby trailer park, he said we had to decide what kind of ministry would it be. We could have chosen to root out all the sources of evil in that place, to chase down the drug dealers and the deadbeat dads, to confiscate handguns and arrest child abusers. Instead, he said, we chose to put up a basketball goal, to tell stories from the Bible, put our arms around little children, and sing songs about Jesus. And 2 years after we started that ministry, 2 years of going out there Saturday after Saturday to do those things, he said, I got a note in my box at church with 5 words on it. Adrian wants to be baptized. Adrian, no relation, the terror of the trailer park. That little girl who had made our work most difficult during the previous 2 years. Who would have guessed? Instead of pulling weeds in the field where she lived, we just tried hard to be wheat. And somehow Adrian saw that and fell in love with it and wanted it for herself. After she was baptized, there was a little more wheat in the field. And because she was there, soon there was even more. In a world full of weeds, perhaps the best strategy we can adopt as Christian people is the strategy of the Apostle Paul, who said in Romans 12:21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. The very namesake of our denomination, as Methodists, John Wesley, said these words, do all the good you can, in all the times you can, in all the places you can, in all the ways you can. Our challenge today is to go out into the world, not to decide or judge who are weeds and who are wheat. For in fact, we all have been both. And maybe we all have both within us. Our job is to go and tend the garden that God has planted in our midst with countless acts of random kindness, with words of compassion and truth, to spread the good news of a God whose love will never fail us. Now, admittedly, that sort of strategy carries some risk. Sometimes what we thought was wheat, what we fed and watered and nurtured, might turn out as weed. That might happen. Can we take our chances? But sometimes, if we're patient and can move forward without guarantees on faith, we may find it really is wheat. Sometimes what we feared would turn out to be an ugly weed really is some beautiful wheat. Well, thank goodness that the God of the universe took that sort of strategy, took his chances on you and on me. Otherwise, I don't suppose any of us would be here today. Let's pray. Sometimes, Lord, in our zeal to make the world right, we do wrong. Sometimes, Lord, in our passion to stand up against forces of evil, we become their partners. Sometimes, Lord, in our impatience to create change, we actually block the change you want to make happen yourself. So, Lord, give us the sort of faith it takes to live in a field where it can be difficult to tell the difference between the wheat and the weeds. But in that sort of environment, help us to do our very best to plant more and more wheat every day. Is our prayer in your name. Amen. I've asked Adrian Wilson to come back and sing once more, Come to Jesus. You've heard the words once. These are words of invitation. I don't know where you are at in your life, and I'm not a high-pressure evangelist, okay? But if you feel a need to come to this altar as he sings and bring whatever's troubling you today or whatever you're joyful about today and lay it at this altar, if you feel compelled to come here and in a public way say, I'm bringing my wheat and my weeds, and I'm giving them all to Jesus to help me sort out, would you come with Adrian?
Come to Jesus.